Welcome, everyone. I hope everyone is staying safe, and I'm glad to see so many people trying to learn new skills while they're stuck at home. Today I'm going to be talking about effective data visualization. My name is Kristin Sainani, and I'm an associate professor at Stanford University, where I teach both statistics and writing. I think data visualization is particularly pertinent to the moment that we find ourselves in. More than any other crisis that I can remember, data visualization is helping to shape the public's understanding of this pandemic. They are being used both to inform the public and policymakers and also to persuade people to change their behaviors. I think by now everyone has probably seen this highly influential flatten the curve graphic. This first appeared in The Economist in late February. That graphic was actually adapted from a 2007 CDC publication in which the CDC was planning for just the kind of pandemic outbreak that we now find ourselves in. But the version of the graphic that you've probably seen is this simpler version that was created by Drew Harris, a professor at Thomas Jefferson University. And what he did was to remove those notes, the 1, 2, 3, and to simplify the graphic by drawing a line to indicate where we would overwhelm the healthcare system. And I think this graphic is particularly persuasive because it's really easy to understand. I think it's helped convince people of why they need to stay home, even if they themselves are not at high risk. And actually, this is the version that's really made the rounds in the media. I saw this on Stephen Colbert. I also saw it on John Oliver, two of my favorite late-night hosts. And actually, journalists have been tracking coronavirus cases in real time using data visualizations, such as the map that you see here. The New York Times has really done some fantastic data visualizations, such as this map, which they update daily to keep the public informed. There are also a number of dashboards worldwide that you can go to track the evolution of the pandemic, such as this dashboard from Johns Hopkins University. So data visualizations are really being used to tell the story of COVID-19. Today I'm going to talk about what makes an effective data visualization. I'm going to highlight some principles of effective data visualization and also tell you what can go wrong. And I'm also going to talk about how you might graph the same data in different ways to tell different stories. I have to give a big shout out to this Reddit group, Data is Ugly. This is a site where people can go and post flawed graphics that they've come across. And actually, most of the problematic graphics that I'm going to show you today, I actually found on this Reddit site. So when I show you those graphics, I'm going to cite the Reddit site. I'm actually not going to cite the original authors, just because my intent is not to criticize any particular authors. If you want a little bit of levity in this time of stress, I highly recommend that after this talk, you go to this site and browse some of the graphics. Some of them are pretty funny. Also, if you are homeschooling your children at the moment and you want to talk with them about data visualization, there's some great examples on there where kids can go and look at the graphic and try to find the mistake. I'll also point out that there's a complementary Reddit group called Data is Beautiful, where you can go if you would like to see examples of excellent data visualizations. Today I'm going to highlight 6 principles of effective data visualization. This is by no means a comprehensive list. You can have whole courses in data visualization, so I'm just going to highlight a few things that I think are important. First, you need to use the right graph for your data. Secondly, you need to be accurate and transparent. And actually, there are many, many ways that you could be inaccurate or non-transparent. There could be a whole course in point 2 up there. I'm just going to highlight a few things today. You need to use color wisely. And then points 4 and 5, cut the clutter and convey a clear take-home message. Those are verbatim principles that I teach when I teach effective writing. So there's actually a lot of overlap between effective data visualization and effective writing. In both cases, you are trying to convey an idea to your reader as clearly and concisely as possible. And then finally, with data visualization, you also have to worry about visual appeal. So I'm going to start with the first principle here, use the right graph for the data. So I'm going to start by reviewing 2 types of graphs that I know you're all familiar with, but that you might not have thought too much about recently. So first of all, bar graphs represent numerical values by the height or length of the bars, and they're typically used to show frequencies. And actually, I dug out some papers from my kids. I think my daughter did these graphs maybe in second grade. On the left-hand side, she graphed hypothetical data on book sales on different days of the week. And on the right-hand side, she actually went around her class and collected data on her classmates about what months they were born, and then she put it into a bar graph. And I actually think it's wonderful to see that they are now teaching probability and data literacy in elementary school. These are things that I did not learn in elementary school. But it's actually funny because my kids think this data stuff is really easy compared to doing things like decimals and fractions and dividing big numbers. So they always say, "Mom, you teach the easy math." And then line graphs are used to show trends over time or some kind of other progression, such as a trend over age or dose. And this is another graph that my daughter did. She did it for a project on climate change this year. You can see that she graphed the average monthly Arctic sea ice from 1978 to 2016. Clearly it's going down. As part of that project, she also made this cute little clay polar bear, so I just had to share that. So a common error in data visualization is to choose the wrong graph for your data. For example, choosing a line graph that really should be a bar graph. So I grabbed this example from that Reddit site that I mentioned. This was just a small survey, and we won't talk about the problems with study design here. We're just going to focus on the graphic. But they asked people, if you were to use marijuana, why would you use it? And so they've got frequencies of different reasons, but they graphed that as a line graph. And you can see that that doesn't work too well because it looks like something is going up and then down as you go across the x-axis. But of course, there's actually no order to the x-axis. So I regraphed these data to show you that these are better represented in a bar graph. When you put this in a bar graph, it's now really easy to pick off the frequencies of these different reasons. You can also have bar graphs that should be line graphs. So I grabbed this graph off of that Reddit site. This graph was actually attributed to Wikipedia. And what it shows is the last 10 world record holders in the men's 100 meters in track and field. So each bar is an athlete, and the y-axis shows their times. But you can see that this really doesn't work well as a bar graph. It's very hard to differentiate the differences between those athletes. Now, I suppose if that was your point, if you were trying to show that we don't improve much in the world record times, maybe that's an okay graphic. But I actually think what they're trying to show here is a progression. And a progression is better represented with a line graph. And so actually, I went to Wikipedia to try to find this graphic. And by the time I got to Wikipedia, it had already been replaced with the correct line graph. So on this line graph, what you're looking at is the x-axis represents the different athletes, and the y-axis is their times. So now you can see how much each athlete improved the world record. So you can see that the biggest improvement was between Tyson Gay and Usain Bolt. Another way to graph these data would have been to use dates on the x-axis if you wanted to show, say, how quickly the world record was falling over time. One other thing to point out is notice that this y-axis does not go down to 0. And some people have the misconception that all y-axes always must go to 0. That's not, in fact, the case. If you're doing a bar graph, you do indeed need to go down to 0 because these bars need to be proportional to the times. But if you're doing a line graph where you're trying to show the relative differences between these times, it's actually okay not to start at 0 so that you can zoom in on these higher times. Here's another graph that I grabbed from that Reddit site. So this was looking at worldwide life expectancy from 1955 to 2015. And the average life expectancy worldwide was 52 years in 1955. That increased to 72 years in 2015. But I'm not quite sure why that is being represented as a spiral. It doesn't really make a lot of sense as a spiral. This would have been better represented as a line graph where the x-axis went from 1955 to 2015. Here's an example of a pie chart where the data really don't belong in a pie chart. So they were asking people about their biggest COVID-19 worries, whether getting it themselves, their family getting it, or the economy. But if you look over at this pie chart, you can see that we have 68%, 62%, and 48%. Well, those clearly don't add up to be 100%. Remember that in a pie chart, you need mutually exclusive categories that add up to 100%. Well, in this case, probably what happened is they allowed people to check off multiple worries. So these are not mutually exclusive categories, and they are not well represented in a pie chart. You'd be better off with something like a bar graph here. Of course, there are many, many other types of graphs beyond bar graphs, pie graphs, and line graphs. I'm showing you a few of my favorites here that I use a lot when I'm analyzing data. So on the left-hand side is a scatter plot. That's used to show the relationships between two continuous variables. On the upper right-hand side, that's a histogram, which is used to show the distribution of variables. And I love histograms. If you ever take a statistics course with me, you'll see that I have lots and lots of slides with histograms on them. In the bottom right, that's a box plot, also used to show the distribution of variables. I do recommend that if you do a box plot, that you superimpose those individual data points so that you can see the individual level data. By the way, all of these graphs are really easy to make in programs like SAS and R. So the second point here is be accurate and transparent. There are lots of ways that you can be inaccurate and non-transparent. So today I'm actually just going to focus on one of the most common ways that people lie with charts. So Edward Tufte is considered the father of data visualization, and he wrote this classic book, The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. And in it, he puts forth several principles of how to be accurate when you're making graphics. One of the most important is, he says, the representation of numbers, as physically measured on the surface of the graphic itself, should be directly proportional to the numerical quantities measured. For example, if you make a bar graph, then those bars need to be proportional to the numbers they represent. And you'll see this is one of the most common mistakes that people make, one of the most common ways that people can mislead you with graphics. I'm going to show you some examples now. Here's a really interesting graphic that I pulled off of that Reddit site. This is showing American deaths by disaster. 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, Benghazi, Ebola, Hurricane Maria, and COVID-19. And these occurred under 3 different presidents, Bush, Obama, and Trump. And you can see that clearly the authors of this graphic were trying to convey a message to you. They are trying to tell you that things were really bad under Obama. But it's pretty easy to pick up the mistake on this graphic. In fact, I showed this one to my children to see if they could figure out the mistake, and they were easily able to pick out the problem here. The problem is that these bars are completely not proportional to the numbers that they represent. The 4 and 2 bar are gigantic, much, much bigger than the 16,000 bar for COVID-19. Of course, this graphic was made a few weeks ago, and we now have many more deaths from COVID-19. So what I did was to take these data and regraph them into a proper bar graph in which the bars are proportional to the number of deaths. And you can see when it's graphed correctly, it gives you a totally different visual story. Here's a graph that was displayed on CNN a few weeks ago, and it's showing coronavirus cases worldwide. It shows 80,000 for Italy, 80,000 for the US, and 81,000 for China. But what you'll notice is that the bar for China is about 50% bigger than the bar for the US. This gives you the impression that there are many more cases in China compared to the US. But I regraphed these data into a proper bar graph, and you can see that the story looks very different when graphed correctly. There isn't really much difference between 81,000 and 80,000. This one is pretty funny. This one is showing average female heights in different countries. And you can see the average height in India is 5 feet, and in Latvia it's 5 feet 5. But there are a couple of problems with this graphic. So first of all, this is a type of bar graph, and so the y-axis actually does need to go down to 0, such that the heights of these figures are proportional to the actual heights. This also has a second problem, though. They are not only using the heights of these figures to represent the numbers, but they are also increasing the width of these figures. And so now area rather than height is being used to visually represent the numbers. And that's a problem because you can see that the area of the figure from India is about 10 times less than the area of the figure from Latvia, giving you the visual impression that Latvian women are 10 times as tall as Indian women. This is a graph that appeared on NBC back when we were worried about the Zika virus. They asked people how concerned they were about the virus, and they could answer very, somewhat, not very, or not at all. But you can see that something went very wrong when they put this into a bar graph, because somehow the 25% bar is bigger than the 28% bar, and the 13% bar is bigger than all of them. So I think someone just messed up on this one. This is a graph about what the European Union is asking its members to pay. The current contribution was 1% of GDP, and they were asking for an increase to 1.08% of GDP. Well, that's an 8% increase, but you can see that the bar on the bottom looks almost twice as big as the bar on the top. This gives you the mistaken visual impression that the increase is much bigger than it actually is. The next principle is that if you're going to use color on your data visualization, you need to use color wisely. In particular, if you're going to use a gradient of colors to represent counts, you need to choose the right color scheme. This is a map from Fox News that was showing confirmed cases of coronavirus. This is from a few weeks ago. But you can see that the color scheme is a little bit problematic here. That bright yellow color really jumps out at you, making you think that there are a lot of cases in those areas, but in fact, yellow represents below 10. Also, there are four different shades of red being used to represent 50 plus, 100 plus, 1,000 plus, and 10,000 plus cases. Now, I don't know about you, but I cannot differentiate those four shades of red, so it's impossible for me to tell where there are 50 cases versus 10,000 cases. Just to show you that the same mistake can happen on the other side of the political aisle, here's a graph from MSNBC that has the same error. In this case, they represented the highest category with a very light color. And so when you look at the map, it gives you the visual impression that there are the fewest cases in New York and lots of cases elsewhere in the US, when in fact New York has the most cases. The fourth principle is cut the clutter. And this is something that I also teach when I teach writing. I try to get students to strip their sentences of all unnecessary words. With a data visualization, it's the same thing. You need to strip your graph of all unnecessary lines, words, tick marks, and elements. Here's a graph that I grabbed from that Reddit site that is obviously overly cluttered. It's really hard to make heads or tails of this graph because there are just so many elements on it. Even if we had a legend available that would help us to decode some of this, there's just so much going on that it's really hard to make sense of. Here's another overly cluttered graph. This is showing different sectors of the economy in different countries, but you can see that so many of these words are overlapping that you can't even read them. And then there's just so much going on here, it's really hard, again, to make sense of. We can also go back to this flatten the curve graphic that I started with at the beginning of this talk. The left-hand version, that's the version from the CDC. On the right, we've got the simpler version created by Drew Harris. And you can see that the CDC's version is more cluttered. It has this 1, 2, 3, and then these little notes that you have to read. So this graphic is going to take longer for a reader to process. Whereas the graphic on the right, you can instantly get the take-home message. I think that's why this particular graphic has been more influential in the pandemic. Now, of course, as with any form of communication, you always have to think about who is your audience. So arguably, if you are making a graphic for other scientists, perhaps it's okay to have a little bit of extra detail. But certainly, if you are trying to communicate with the public, you want to make that graphic as easy to understand as possible. The fifth point here is that you need to convey a clear take-home message. And this is exactly the same thing as when you write something. Before you sit down to write something, you need to know what is it that you are trying to tell the reader. What is your take-home message? If you don't know that, you're not going to be able to communicate anything clearly to your reader. Well, it's the same with a data visualization. You actually need to have in your head a take-home message. You're not just throwing a bunch of data on a piece of paper. You're actually trying to construct something that tells your reader a message. So you have to have a clear idea of what that message is before you go to build that data visualization. I also grabbed this graphic from that Reddit site, and it's asking, how contagious is coronavirus? There's a number of things that are problematic with this graphic. So first of all, I'm not sure why they are representing these data with a pie chart. There's really no reason that infectivity of different viruses would lend itself to a pie chart. Why would those add up to 100%? I'm not sure. I'm also not sure what the numbers mean. They're given as percentages, but I'm not sure why the infectivity of the virus would be a percentage. maybe this is some kind of relative infectivity of different viruses, but I'm not sure. And then finally, I'm not really sure what the authors wanted me to take away from this graphic. Are they trying to show me that coronavirus is not that infectious compared to other viruses, or are they trying to show me that it has a similar infectivity to other flus? I'm not really sure that they knew what they were trying to convey when they built this graphic, so I'm unable to walk away with a clear take-home message. This graph is about marketing, knowledge, and learning, but it's actually quite dizzying. There's a lot going on here, and I'm having trouble making heads or tails of this graphic. I really can't figure out what it is that the authors were trying to convey here. Now, here's an example of a well-done data visualization with a clear take-home message. This is actually often pointed to as an example of excellent data journalism. It comes from the Wall Street Journal, and it's showing cases of measles. The rows are different states, and the columns are different years. And you can see that there's this nice dark line where the vaccine was introduced in 1963. This tells a very quick visual story. You can see that there was a large drop-off in the cases of measles after the vaccine was introduced. Now, if you scroll out to about the year 2003, you'll notice that there's a little bit of an uptick in measles cases. And in fact, this graph only goes until 2013. But I bet if we were to graph it out now to 2020, you would see an even bigger uptick, and that's of course due to vaccine deniers. Here's another example of a graph with a clear take-home message. This was posted recently on 538.com, and this is graphing data from different polls that were conducted between March and April, asking Americans whether or not they trust the CDC on COVID-19. And you can see that they mostly do trust the CDC. About 80 to 90% of Americans say they trust the CDC versus about 10 to 20% who say that they distrust the CDC. The final point here is that if you're doing data visualization, you also have to worry about making it visually appealing. Now, I am certainly not an expert in design. There are people who study design principles. I'm just going to share with you a couple of examples of what I find more or less visually appealing. This is a dashboard from the Singapore government for COVID-19, and you can see that it's quite elegant, right? It's on this nice white background. It has these pleasing colors. It's not overly cluttered. It reminds me a little bit of like an Apple computer design, so I find this one quite visually appealing. Contrast that to the COVID-19 dashboard from the Hong Kong government. Now, there's nothing wrong with this dashboard statistically. The numbers are just fine, but I find it a bit less visually appealing. It's a little bit more cluttered. I don't really like the black background and the neon colors. It just doesn't have as much visual appeal to me. The last thing I want to talk about here is the point that you can correctly graph the same data in many different ways to tell different stories. I'm going to use COVID-19 as an example to show you a couple of different statistical and design choices that you can make when graphing your data in order to tell different stories. This first example shows the difference between representing counts as height or length versus area. So on April 6th, this graph on the left-hand side was published in the New York Times, and I found it quite visually striking. It caught my attention. This was actually an interactive graphic, and we haven't talked about interactive graphics today, but I'll note that a lot of the online data visualizations for COVID-19 are actually interactive. You can hover over things to see specific case counts in specific states, or they show videos where you see the evolution of things over time. And so the graphic on the left here was a little video where you could see the total number of deaths growing over time, and the number of deaths is represented with these red spikes. It's represented with height. Now, on the same day in the New York Times, deaths were also plotted with this map that you see on the right, and the numbers of deaths were represented with areas, with circles. And you can see that these are visually quite different. Now, of course, you might argue that the graph using area to represent deaths, that the scale was very small. They used small circles to represent death counts, and also those circles were not colored. But I pulled from the New York Times that same day this graph which they used to represent case counts. So you can imagine that if we represented the deaths with bigger circles and we turn them red, this is about what it would look like. So now we kind of have a more fair comparison to compare the death counts with height versus with area. And you can still see that there's a visual difference here. The human brain processes height and length differently than it processes the area. We actually have an easier time processing length and height than we do area. So I still think that the graph on the left is more dramatic. It's more visually striking, and that's because it's representing numbers with height rather than area. Another choice you have to make when graphing coronavirus case counts is whether or not to graph them on a linear scale or a logarithmic scale. And just to remind you, linear scale means that one tick mark on the y-axis represents one case. So here we're going from 100K to 200K to 300K to 400K. In contrast, on a logarithmic scale, those tick marks correspond to powers. So here you can see that we start at 1, that's 10 to the power 0, and then we go to 10, that's 10 to the power 1, then 100 is 10 to the power 2, then 1000 is 10 to the power 3. So those lines actually represent powers rather than absolute counts. Both of these are perfectly correct ways of representing the data. They just tell different stories. They just highlight different aspects of this virus. So if you graph things on a linear scale, what you're going to see are these nice exponential curves. If you are trying to convince the public that this pandemic is about to explode, then you might want to choose a linear scale. A logarithmic scale gives you different information, though. If you graph things on a logarithmic scale, that tells you something about the rate of growth. If you have a straight line, that would mean that there is a constant rate of growth for the virus. If you have a line that curves upward, as this bottom line, this bottom orange line, this is the US at the beginning of the pandemic, you can see that it's curving upwards. That means the growth rate of the virus is increasing with time. And then this blue line is China, and you can see that that curve is bending downwards. That means that the rate of growth of the virus is actually decreasing over time. And that's what people mean when they say bending the curve. This blue curve has been bent. China was actually able to bend the curve and get the growth rate down to 0. You can see that actually the line becomes flat or horizontal after a while. Another choice you have to make when graphing coronavirus cases is whether or not you want to leave those case counts unadjusted for population size or whether or not you want to adjust for population size. And so I took these screenshots a couple of weeks ago, and you can see that at that point in the pandemic, China, that's that blue line, if you look at the top left graph, that is not adjusted for population size. So the total counts of cases was similar at that point in China as to other countries in the world. But you can see that if you adjust for population size, over here on the bottom right, that line for China drops. Compared to the large number of people in China, the burden in China was relatively less than other countries in the world, even at that point in the pandemic. Now, I've seen it hotly debated on Twitter as to which of these is more correct than the other. In fact, they're both just fine. They just answer different questions. So if you want to know something about like how many ventilators are you going to need, then you want to look at absolute case counts not adjusted for population size. However, if you want to say something about how well a particular country is doing in controlling its pandemic and the total burden or total impact on that country, then you're going to want to adjust for population size because, of course, countries that have more people have greater potential to have large numbers of cases. So you need to take that into account. My take-home messages are data visualizations can be highly impactful as we're seeing during this current pandemic. Data visualizations can also be used to intentionally or unintentionally mislead people. An effective data visualization avoids distortions and manipulations. It also follows principles of effective communication. Just as when you're writing, you want to convey an idea to your reader as clearly and concisely as possible. And then finally, I made the point that the same data can be represented in different ways to tell different stories. If you want to learn more about data visualization, I have some books here that I would recommend. So Edward Tufte's The Visual Display of Quantitative Information is a classic. I also like Albert Caro's book on How Charts Lie. If you want more of a primer about how to actually make these visualizations, I would recommend Kieran Healy's book. For a journalist perspective, Knowledge is Beautiful by David McCandless is good. I also already mentioned those 2 Reddit sites, so if you just want to browse some examples of good and bad data visualizations, I highly recommend those 2 Reddit sites. For those of you looking for more online training while you're stuck at home, I do offer some other resources. So first of all, I write a statistics column for the journal PM&R. You can access those columns at the link there, and those cover different specific topics in statistics. So if you want to learn about principal components analysis or logistic regression or instrumental variable analysis, or topics in data visualization such as scatter plots, box plots, and histograms, you can go there. I try to make those very readable. If you'd like some further online training in medical statistics, if you'd like to learn how to analyze your own data and make data visualizations in SAS and R, as well as learn about basic concepts in probability and statistics, I recently launched a certificate program in medical statistics. I'll say a bit more about that in just a second here. And then finally, as I mentioned before, I also teach writing. So if you want to learn to be a better writer, I offer a course called Writing in the Sciences on Coursera, and the link to that is there. As I mentioned, I recently launched a certificate program in medical statistics that involves 3 courses. In MedStats 1, we'll teach you how to do basic programming in SAS or R. There is no previous experience in programming required. We will start you right at the download and help you from there. That course also covers descriptive statistics and some data visualization. MedStats 2 covers probability and statistical inference, such as p-values, confidence intervals, and Bayesian inference. I'll show you how to use SAS and R to do computer simulations to illustrate some of those concepts. And then finally, in MedStats 3, I cover specific statistical plots and tests that are used for certain types of medical data. If you're interested in the certificate program and in those courses, the link for that is here, and you can go and check that out. Thanks everyone for watching. Stay safe, and I hope to interact with a lot of you online in the future.